MBS KFEL Denver, Monday, April 13th, 1942, 7:15 to 7:30 p.m. Mountain West Time, an analysis of propaganda by Siegfried Wagner. Good evening. Tonight, while I'm talking to you, the water from the melting snow on the Continental Divide is rushing by this mountain cabin. It's coming down from the hills with such vigor and in such volume that you can almost hear it out there on the eastern seaboard in Texas and California and the Midwest. Stretching the truth a tad on that one. It is the spring song of the Rocky Mountains. And the Colorado River does come from the top of here and feeds all of the western United States. It is the spring song of the Rocky Mountains, the eternal high psalm of hope and of the roaring defiance. It fills the air of every hour and day and night, here in the very heart of America with the rock-bound assurance there is no death, there is no defeat, there is only recreation and everlasting victory for the forces of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If that is nature's own propaganda, I, for one, am unable not to agree. I believe and I think I speak for the vast majority of the American people that optimism is a natural state of the human being. Just as natural as it is for these towering mountains here to shed every spring their coat of ice and snow and to dress themselves in the green mantle of life, fertility, and summer. Today, April 13th, is Thomas Jefferson's birthday, and last night Moscow radio celebrated it. The speaker pointed out that Thomas Jefferson stands for the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, while Adolf Hitler stands for death, slavery, and the pursuit of misery. That was a point well taken, and it showed what effort they are making in Moscow these days to come up with an honest understanding of and real cooperation with the people of the United States. Well, do I remember the time before Hitler attacked Russia, when the Moscow radio had nothing but derision for the same American traitors and traditions which it now celebrates? That was the time when neither we nor they did want to see it, that Russia and America both have to fight for the very same thing, no matter how far apart we are in our respective political faith. Now spring has come once more over the world, and in the rush and urge of events, in the tumultuous roar of war, Russia and America have been thrown so close together that one is celebrating the traditions and national holidays of the other. It is a sign that there is no obstacles too high and no problems too deep between two nations which cannot be overcome by peaceful collaboration. The common premise for such collaboration of American and Russian people is that, if you go back to the Bible days, it was Esau and Jacob. We come from the same family. But brothers fight, and Esau fights the most. But in times of need, they are together. Brothers stand up for brothers. So let's see what Siegfried had to say, and I'll stop on that. It is a sign that there are no obstacles too high and no problems too deep between two nations which cannot be overcome by peaceful collaboration. The common premise for such collaboration of the American and Russian people is that both pursue the war against Hitler and his Axis without reservations, with no holds barred, and with all that is in them. Neither the Russians nor we have much sympathy with those leaders of India who meekly bowed down to Jap propaganda, which, as I reported about a week ago in these broadcasts, threatened India with utter destruction if she would accept Sir Stafford Cripes' proposal from Great Britain of giving them their independence. The Jap radio has made the same threat against America and America's enemy number 2, Admiral Yamamoto, has even promised to dictate to us his peace terms in the White House in Washington. But the Russian people cheer us on. They slap us on the back and are ready to stand by in any eventuality which may arise, when we laugh right into Yamamoto's hard-bitten face and say, "Brother, you ain't seen nothing yet." And how serious are the Russians? And how serious the Russians are in this matter, they demonstrated their warning to Japan to adhere to the very letter of the last Russo-Japanese treaty, or else. Russian shortwave propaganda alone is a clear indication of how much intense kinship there is between the fighting spirit of America and the fighting spirit of Russia. Jacob and Esau. When Moscow radio is on the air and talking to America, every word and sentence betrays that they are fighting mad in Russia and that they don't care who knows it. It is this sort of talk like to hear in this country. I'm going to read that again. Russian shortwave propaganda is clear indication of how much intense kinship there is between the fighting spirit of America and the fighting spirit of Russia. When Moscow radio is on the air and talking to America, every word and sentence betrays that they are fighting mad in Russia and that they don't care who knows it. It is the sort of talk we like to hear in this country. The same cannot be said about British radio. Traditionally, the speakers of British Broadcasting Corporation talk with a cool, calm reserve. They feel that it is not in best form to show their true emotions, even though their own Winston Churchill and Stafford Cripes go over so big with the American listening audience because they feel no qualms about showing their emotions. I always like to listen to J.B. Priestley. He has lived in our country out here in the West, and he has a fine feeling for American sensibilities. But what struck me in his latest dissertation was that he was decidedly unruffled attitude towards all that many subjects with which he was dealing with in his home chitty chat. Must be in England. But what struck me in his latest dissertation was his decidedly unruffled attitude toward all the many subjects with which he was dealing in his home chitty chat. He talked about the sensible frugality with which this war is driven home with the British people. He had a word of criticism for the fascist newsreel commentators who seemed to be getting on the British nerves. With a smile, he approved of the prohibition in Chongqing, China, from where he went, to the big new British bombers, and finally to Hitler's appeal to the Nazi Party troops to behave orderly. It was a talk which a fellow would like to hear in rocking chair when he feels at peace with the world and doesn't want to be disturbed too much about the war. It provided just that tingle of excitement which would keep a fellow from dozing off, and it was most decidedly not fighting talk. It was typical for an attitude taken by most of the BBC speakers. They are calm and almost unconcerned about the war. Whether it is a war commentator like aviation expert Oliver Stewart, a propaganda analyst like James Ferguson, or a clergyman, they all act and talked as if the war was already in the bag, and there was nothing really to be worried about. Now, this makes for a nice, relieving contrast to the hysterical, ferocious, off-centered propaganda broad blast which the Axis shortwave stations dish up hot and steaming. They always sound half-cracked and as if Mussolini had really gone insane, as some reports had it today. It could have happened simply by listening too much to his own propaganda outbursts, if he hadn't been mad for a good many years already. Talking about Mussolini. But if the British radio wants to offset and contrast the Axis radio by way of indomitable equanimity, it seems to be doing too much of a good thing. As American listeners are concerned, after all, we have no intention of fighting the war in a rocking chair, nor do we want to be kept merely from dozing while listening to war commentaries. In fact, we want to sit bolt upright with all of our senses on alert when someone in London gives us his considered opinion on this war in which we have, I know, if you listen to BBC Today, it's the same thing. On this war in which we have pledged some 30 million of our own to be drafted for military and civilian service. We no longer care if a radio speaker aggravates us or whether we like what he has to say, as long as what he says is pertinent as to what we or our allies or should be doing. All right, BBC, listen to this sentence. Considering your opinion on this war in which we have pledged some 30 million of our own people to be drafted for military or civilian service, we no longer care if a radio speaker aggravates us or whether we like what he has to say, or we like what he says, as long as what he says is pertinent as to what we or our allies do or should be doing. Our government Our own government spokesmen make no bones about their emotions. And many a time when I listened to Donald Nielsen, he got me just as fighting mad as I thought he was. That's what I wanted, and that is what all Americans want, to share with their spokesman a common emotion, a common band, a common determination. It may be called effective propaganda, but that is what we want. And get it. When we listen to the President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill, who fully realize the demand, and I'm in the Roosevelt National Forest. But that is what we want and get. When we listen to President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill, who fully realize the demand of their radio audiences, that this is no time to pull punches, and no time either to fight a gentleman's war against a horde of barbarians and gangsters. The Moscow radio never mentions the German army without calling it the Hitlerites. Maybe that is a name calling and should therefore be detested by decent people, but it is also a rousing good way to never let the listeners for one moment forget Hitler and all the damnable connotations of that man's name. It keeps in the foreground of the listener's mind the real issue of this war and reminds him without relief, as there is no relief in this war until we have finished it, of the horrendous atrocities and treacheries committed by the one man whom the world tried to stop too late. For the British radio to appear unruffled and under heavy bombing was one thing, but to appear unruffled no matter which way the war goes is quite another. That attitude nearly lost Britain the last war, and it might be well to recall the historical fact that it was General Pershing who, sufficiently concerned at the St. Mihiel, to go into action right away and not to wait another year for all the reserves to come up. In that way, the Kaiser was defeated within a few months, uncounted lives were saved, and nameless misery prevented. It was done because the general refused to take a rocking chair attitude while the fight was on for Thomas Jefferson's grand concept of the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that is my analysis of propaganda for the present. The shortwave stations I have referred to were Moscow RV-15, RV-11, London GSD, GSC, GSP, and most of the stations in Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo. And now, from the roof of America, where the whitewater is coming down from Long's Peak, I wish you a pleasant good night. Not amazing? Thank you, Siegfried Wagner. Thank you for buying this land, and thank you for giving it to my grandma. And thank you for telling me the truth of what it was and warning us of what will be.